My friends, we have already worshiped today through the music, through the prayers. Willa, you can speak any day you want to. Through what we have heard, God's word of love and acceptance has been proclaimed, and anything I do at this moment is just fanciness on the margins, I feel. For those of you who do not know me, I am the Reverend Dr. David Popham, Associate Conference Minister, at least for the short term, with the Central Atlantic Conference of the United Church of Christ. This is my home church. You don't see me that often. I'm often somewhere else. I happen to be here today because our daughter graduated high school on Friday along with some other folks, so we're excited about that. And after church, I will be leaving somewhat quickly to catch a plane so I too can get to Synod, which is where everybody else is at. And I was literally looking up the flight times, thinking, when do I fly out on Sunday, when Ann Walowski called and said, would you be available to do the sermon today? So I thought, well, that must be the Spirit telling me either one or two things, either yes or don't go to Synod. So I'm not quite sure which of those was it, but I chose yes. And I want to echo what Willa said earlier. This does not happen, what we are doing today. About 7 years ago, I was writing an article on pride worship, and I was looking for a queer altar to go along with that article. And I scoured the internet, finding but two pieces. And I had she's still a friend who's done work on LGBT issues and Christian iconography, and I emailed her and I said, this is all I could find. What else is out there? And she emailed me back. She says, that's it. But here we are today. So I do want to point out what the flags are. Some have asked their meaning. So we're going to start over here on my right, on the far side. If I have this wrong, just somebody let me know. But I understand we have the lesbian flag, the bisexual flag, the asexual flag, the traditional pride flag, what is now coming to be called the inclusive pride flag with colors for people of color, the pansexual flag, the transgender flag, and the leather flag, which makes me wonder, where's my harness? I didn't think to wear it today. But all of these flags are summed up in the flags that the kid had. The peace that people in the LGBT community we find when we find ourselves whole in the love of God. And that is what we are here to celebrate today. One other piece, I know some of you are aware of this and some of you are not, but I stand before you today also as the conference minister-elect for the Hawaii Conference of the United Church of Christ. I assumed that position in mid-September. Thank you. I tell you that to tell you this other story. Some of you might be asking, by what right do I stand in the pulpit on Pride Sunday to deliver a message from and to the LGBTQ plus community? And as a reminder that for those of us who are in the community, that coming out is a continuous process that never ends. For those of you who are unaware, Carrie and I share a mixed orientation marriage. That means she is the straight partner and I am the gay partner. Having spent 2 weeks in Hawaii explaining our relationships at 17 different meet and greets, I will not go into that today. Although I will note the irony that I spent 2 weeks convincing Hawaii of my human credentials, only to come back here and have to convince you of my gay credentials. Oy right? Join me in prayer. Oh, gracious God, may the words of all of our mouths and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing unto you. Amen. The parable before us today is a parable of reversal. There's a number of those that came from the lips of Jesus, and this is one of them. In this one, the exalted will be humbled, and the humbled will be exalted. That's the point of the parable, or at least the point I'm going to wrestle with. It fits with Jesus' emphasis that the meek will inherit the earth, and the last shall be first. With this parable, we encountered the quintessential Jesus of the first three Gospels. A Jesus who's on the margin of society, calling the disenfranchised to be comfortable in their humility. For in God's heart, they are exalted and first. Personally, this is the Jesus I embrace, the insignificant Christ, and applaud the Synoptic Gospel's ability to keep him at society's margins. Any attempt, in my opinion, to make Jesus the center of power or even the center of history is a violation of the homeless, wandering Messiah of first century Palestine. When we fail to recognize that Jesus lived on the margins, we fail to recognize Jesus at all. In a significant way in which the church has yet to understand, we must truly celebrate the disenfranchised Christ who loved and laughed and suffered as all disenfranchised people do. The Black liberation theologian James Cone was correct when he famously concluded that Jesus is black. Cone validated this connection as a way of involving the life and work of Jesus in the marginalized communities of African Americans. And in this same vein, we today can declare Jesus is queer, and that he faced the same rejection and prejudice from a fearful society as does we who live in the LGBTQ community. And while I rejoice in a Christ who speaks not from the center but from the margins, I must confess there is a part of this parable that I find a little too meek. Waiting for someone to invite me to the place of honor seems to give that someone a lot of power over me. Queer pride has taught me not to relinquish such power to others as if the best I can ever hope for is the leftovers from the heterosexist table. Pride has taught me how to claim my seat at the table of humanity without apology and without self-reproach. To say to all churches, you are suspect because of the centuries of oppression that you perpetrated and some still perpetrate. But that's my wrestling with the passage. Today we are here celebrating pride, and to understand this queer pride that motivates me, we must understand some of the historic struggles of the LGBTQ plus community. This year in particular marks the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall riots. What is largely seen as the galvanizing event for the gay community, for gay rights, queer rights in the USA, and sparkling similar movements across the globe for sexually and gender diverse people. The truth of the matter is that there is probably now more myth than reality as to what happened in the early hours of June 28, 1969. But here is what we know. We know that Stonewall was a bar that catered to African Americans and Puerto Rican Americans, people on the margins of the margins. We know that there was an unexpected raid on the bar. Usually they were tipped off beforehand. Typically, these raids followed a pattern of police harassment and arresting men dressed in drag and women dressed in men's clothing, since being transgendered was a criminal offense and cross-dressing was considered an act of transgender issues. On this raid, though, the paddy wagons were late. And so a crowd began to gather, and they began to chant gay power and even singing, "We shall overcome." And in the midst of this, an unidentified, unknown African-American lesbian, described later as, quote, "a typical New York butch," end quote, had been entangled with the police on the sidewalk for an extended period, waiting for the paddy wagon and inciting the crowd. Last week, the Reverend Phyllis talked to us about the nudging of the Spirit. No doubt this woman was nudged by the Christ on the margins. For when they finally took her to throw her into the paddy wagon, she shouted out to the crowd, "Why don't you guys do something?" And a riot broke out. In the midst of this incident with the African-American woman, someone also cried out, "They didn't pay off the cops," because that's what was expected. At which time, the homeless youth who were staying in a nearby park, the homeless gay youth, I need to say, began throwing their change at police officers, forcing them back into the bar. You heard that right. Homeless gay youth forced down the heterosexist society as represented in the police gathered that night, which tells you that if you want to change the world, get the youth involved, because they can see the hypocrisy we have decided we're comfortable with. That's what happened in those morning hours 50 years ago to people who felt the sting of oppression, who were shut out of family and out of society, who were told they were perverts and an offense to God, when they found self-pride, which was so strong, so beautiful, so amazing, that it let out a collected yell, "We are whole and we shall not be called broken." And that yell still echoes today, replaced by the modern pride anthem, "Born This Way," as we heard earlier. Woo, woo, for the Gaga fans in the house, do we have? And that is queer pride at its best. So it is in my queer pride I wrestle with this parable of Jesus. Why should we give up our seats at the table because someone else says we should? Why can't the host move if they are uncomfortable with who we are? Why must we yield to some contrived system of honor? And as often happens with me in the Bible, this is where the parable begins to wrestle back. It feels good. It feels really good to speak about queer pride or black pride or feminist and womanist pride. All of these prides at the margins, lifting their people up. However, to speak of pride in the center, white pride, straight pride, male pride, they have a very different feeling about them, don't they? It's a bit icky. These dominant prides mask prejudicial attitudes which seek to oppress and bully, and we understand that. And this parable calls us to acknowledge the twin siblings of good pride and conceited pride. Good pride raises up a group out of oppression. Conceited pride tyrannizes. It is into this often ambiguous mixture of motivations and ideologies and family resemblances of the twin prize that Jesus speaks this parable and introduces the twins to their cousin, humility. Humility, particularly as Jesus deals with it, has nothing to do with self-effacing and self-condescending attitudes or with puffing up and showcasing. Rather, for Jesus, humility has to do with owning our greatness and knowing when to yield that greatness. We yield our rightful place at the table because we know that others are also worthy of a seat of honor, and we can celebrate that with and for them. If we look to Jesus as our example, particularly through the metaphor of a high Christology, humility is this. It is knowing that you are the second person of the Trinity through whom and for whom creation exists, yet yielding all of that to be disenfranchised and marginalized to the point of state-sponsored execution. And for me, this is the greatest mystery of the faith. God's risk in self-negation without a guarantee of receiving the self back. Now I begin to understand this parable. It's just not about a place at the party. This parable is a strong comment on culture and society where the marginalized have value and greatness and abundance, along with an appropriate sense of humility. Pride and humility are not adversaries in competitions for our allegiance. They are kissing cousins, which help us to own ourselves as whole and beloved of God, while also allowing others to own themselves in the same manner, which is what the pride in the center forgets all about. And here's the challenge. Jesus says we can extend humility even in the midst of our own woundedness. And it is at this point that the way of Jesus and the way of gay pride cross each other. Let me echo the wisdom of Kathy Buckley. Take your right hand, your left hand if you're left-handed. Take your dominant hand, place it on your heart. Feel that heartbeat? Your heart is yours to love, honor, and respect. This is you. There is only one of these, and you're it. You are the gift that has been put in this universe. You are not broken. You are not a pervert. You are not a shame before God. You are God's good gift to God's good creation. That heartbeat you are feeling, that is yours, precious and holy. Thanks be to God.